In 2022, they made an announcement that they would be making a Warhammer 40k TV series / movie starring Henry Cavill. When I heard that news, I knew exactly what I wanted to make. I wanted to do Henry Cavill as Captain Titus. Unfortunately, it wasn't going to be as easy as I thought it would be. All of the figures produced for the Warhammer genre are in 28mm, which is about 1/60th scale, which means they are way too small for my needs. If you try and blow up those small figures, all the detail just looks way too chunky. So that project ended up in development hell for about 18 months until, out of the blue, I saw an awesome channel by the name of Ground Affected that I subscribed to do a large scale print of Captain Titus, and instantly my project was resurrected. Shout out to your dad at Ground Affected. He does some awesome stuff. I'll leave his links in the description. Right, as soon as I got the files, I did blow them up by 150%, just like your dad did. And boy, these were such good looking files. Took me 3 plates and a huge amount of time. In fact, the total amount of time was about 70 hours of printing. I sliced them in Chitterbox, and once I did that, I was off to my printer, which was the PHROZEN Mega 8KS. For the first batch, I used some of this Aqua Hyperfine from PHROZEN. It's water based, it's fantastic, does great detail as well. Now, like I said, there was about 75 hours. The first print was about 27 hours, somewhere around there. This Mega S has a huge build plate. I remember when I did my very first figure, which was Batman, and I did that on a Mono SE Anycubic printer. It took me 2 weeks of printing. This one, I did it in 3 plates. With the latest version of Chitterbox, the auto support seemed to work really well, and the whole model was just done with auto supports. Now this build plate, as you can see, it's got the perforated plate, and I've never had an issue with any of the models not adhering to the plate. On the other side of that coin, it does take a bit of effort to get the models off that plate. That Mega 8KS is such a great addition to my workflow. Once I scraped off those models, I then cleaned off the excess resin with some old IPA. Once the IPA gets too dirty in my PHROZEN wash machine, I then just pour it into this tub. And I use that to get rid of the excess resin on the models when it comes straight out of the printer. Talking about wash machine, this is the PHROZEN Wash Mega S, and look at the size of the tub, it's huge. It holds like 24 litres of IPA, so you can do these large prints quite easily and do most of it in one hit. But of course, as the plate finished printing, I would wash that as the other plate's printing. So I didn't get the chance to put the whole lot in, in one hit. IPA is a bit stinky, so make sure you put that lid back on. Now you get a choice of low or high speed. I've never used low because I don't tend to do really small fine detail, so I tend to do it on high, and usually about 10 to 12 minutes. I went for 10 minutes, but it went overboard and went to 12, so I use that. The wash machine has dual impellers, so it does quite a thorough job on cleaning those model bits. Now normally, once that bit's done, I tend to just lift up the basket, stick it on a slight angle once I've shaken most of the IPA off, or IPA, and then just let it sit there for about 5 to 10 minutes, let it drip. Then I'll wash it down with some soapy water before I put it into my mega super duper curing machine. Again, another one from PHROZEN, huge volume area, so I can do quite a fair bit of those large scale prints in there. It also has some fans in there, so if you want a dry model you can do that, but I tend to leave my models just air dry. No particular reason, I just do once I've washed them. Just like every other curing machine, it does have a rotating turntable. Now I did screw up a bit with setting up the timer for this. I set it for, I think it was 10 minutes, and because I'm using the Hyperfine water washable one, it's supposed to do it for a minimum of 30 minutes. So I did go back and readjust that off camera. Depending on the resin you use, you may only need maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Now, I did run out of the Hyperfine, so I ended up using a couple of different brands of resin for this build, but check out all the parts that I had to print. That's a lot of parts. And like I said, 75 hours worth of printing. I don't even know how many pieces were there, except there was a lot. You can see the details really nice on that. Now, because of the type of resin, it does scratch very easily, but it doesn't actually damage it. Once you put a coat of paint over it, it disappears, there's nothing there. During this whole printing process, I didn't have any failures whatsoever. Now, due to the large scale of this model, it's pretty hard to stay away from any type of layer lines, and I did get some minor ones in there, so I will need to do a bit of preparation from there. Didn't matter what type of resin I use, but because they were such big and sort of, flat areas, even though they have slight curves to it, I did, like I said, I did get some printing lines. I did do these as hollow prints, so because of that I need to have vent holes, and now I need to seal them up. So I'm using some of this Let's resin, and this is the bonding resin that I've used in a couple previous other builds. Now it takes only 5 to 10 seconds with this UV torch that you can get from them as well. And I found the best way to do it is put a little blob of resin on there, turn it upside down, and it creates a little dome, and just hit it with a UV torch, and then you can just file it and sand it down. For the sanding, I used some 400 grit sandpaper. Now this is a wet and dry. I just use a small baking tray full of water and just give it a nice light sand. The layer lines were really fine, so it only took me about maybe 15 minutes, maximum 20 minutes to do all the parts. To paint the model, I used some of this Rust-Oleum, and it's paint and primer, and in this case I used the black, and off camera I just gave all the parts a nice even coat of the black. And it came up really well, and like I said, those little scratches disappear completely. Now I'm using Zenithal lining, and for that some of this Liquitex, which is titanium white. I've had this bottle for a number of years, and it actually goes quite a long way. Now to get Zenithal lining, all you do is spray from one direction. That then gives you the highlights and the shadows, and when you do the top coats, you do a light coat and you retain those shadows. You can see there, I probably did maybe too much white, could have had slightly more shadows, but that's okay, it'll look good. Captain Titus is an ultramarine, so which means he needs to be blue. So I'm using some of this French blue from Vallejo. Even if it is paint for an airbrush, I'll still put in a couple drops of thinner in there. When I do the first coat, I'll make sure it's a very thin coat so I don't lose any of those shadows. I personally prefer to paint in a circular motion, that way I won't get any paint streaks. You don't want straight up and down and across, so with a circular motion that disguises any airbrush, like I said, streaks. Every time I hear the word streak, it just reminds me of 1970s Australian cricket. Once I've done that base coat, I add a slight amount of white to that blue, then hit some of the higher areas, just to add a bit of contrast to the bodywork. This is burnt umber, and I'm going to use this for all the fabric areas on the figure. Again, circular motions. And these are some of the victory ribbons, and there's 3 of those, and of course the handle for the thunder hammer. Again, I've added a couple drops of white to this and hit the high areas. Then onto some flat black, again from Vallejo. Majority of my paints are Vallejo. And this is for that garment, undergarment thingamajig. I have no idea what it is. If you know, let me know in the comments, because they're kind of rubbery, I think. Imperial Stormtroopers have them as well. This colour is called red leather. And I'm hitting the belt, the utility belt. These are probably made of Batman's, who knows. But he has a utility belt as well. To dry brush that, some of this dry brushing paint from Ammo, and this is the dark sand. And by the way, dry brushing brushes are available from my new project. I do have a store now at scalemodelgeek.com.au. Go check it out. I don't have a light blue in the dry brushing paint, so I'm using a combination of this light sand and a drop or two from the Vallejo, the French blue. And that comes up great, and you can see it's a much lighter blue and it's quite thick, perfect for dry brushing. And very carefully and lightly I hit all the edges, and it brings out some more of the detail. For the black areas, those rubbery areas, some of this Panzer grey. And right in there with some dry brushing brushes. And for the smaller, tighter areas, I just used a smaller dry brushing brush. For the metal areas, some of this gun metal. And he's got this chain around his arm. And I hit that with the gun metal. Then off camera, I did hit it with a bit of the silver as well. Just some random areas, not the whole thing. And this really brings out the detail. And of course, if you've got a gun, you've got to have gunmetal dry brushing for it as well. Dry brushing really brings out a lot of the detail. There is some nice detail on the pauldron, which is the shoulder armor that I need to paint. And I do need to have these in red, but you can't just put red on top of blue. You do need to put down a white base color so the red looks like red. I do need to paint a section on his leg armor. Now this area, I did a bit of research and I couldn't work out exactly what color it was. Some reference images had it in silver and others had it in white. So personally, I'm going to go for the white. There was a lot more images of it in white. And for the base coat, I'm using some of this white grey. Again, circular motion. Make sure I get a fairly nice even coat. And then I hit it with a white to get a bit of highlight right at the top. I'm using some of this white, again from Vallejo. Like I said, right at the top, at the curve, and a very light spray. And then it's a matter of pulling off all the masking tape, and if I've done a good job, I'll get some nice crisp lines. And I'll probably give myself, oh, I don't know, about 9 out of 10. This is the red I'll be using for that pauldron. Colors are really affected by the color of the base coat. So if you paint a white, you're going to get a very red if you're using red. Okay, got it? Red. Now this figure of Captain Titus has been in battle, so we need to give him a bit of weathering. So as a base wash, I'm using some of that dark brown. And I give it a light spritz of water and then cover the whole thing quite liberally with some of that wash. I'll make sure I get into all the crevices. I prefer using the brown wash. It's just, to me, it looks a bit more natural. If I go for black, it's too heavy and looks a bit too oily. So I usually leave the wash on for about 30 seconds or so, let it soak into the paint, and then using a makeup sponge, I then dab off most of that wash. For the smaller areas, I use some of this panel line accent color, which is black from Tamiya, and I hit it mainly the black areas with it, but I will do the armor, but in small areas. Obviously not the whole thing, just in the smaller edges, like I said. Now, one thing I did forget to mention off camera before I started any of these washes, I did give the model a coat of clear matte, just to protect it. If something goes a bit strange, I can wipe it off. This panel line is super thin and it runs everywhere. And it does bleed, so you have to be a bit careful when you're putting it on. This gold is for the emblems that are on his armor and also the standard or the flaggy thing. Now this gold's from Model Master, and you're probably thinking, hey Geek, didn't they discontinue this? Yes, they did, and I think it was about 2020 they stopped making these Model Master paints. The thing is, this particular tin I've had since the mid-90s, and I love the gold. It's the best gold I've ever used. It looks so good. With the body armor all done, it's time to move on to Henry Cavill himself. I've had a figure of Henry Cavill as Superman in my files for a number of years. It's from the Man of Steel, and I thought this would be a perfect base to modify. After a bit of research, I found a great picture of Captain Titus, and I just started doing some modifications in Blender. I changed Henry's hair around, added some scars to his forehead, just above his eye and across his lip, and also those studs on his forehead. They are actually service studs and record how many years he's been fighting. I did print up 3 heads, so it gave me an opportunity to experiment a bit with colours. And look at the detail, very nice detail. I did get some minor print lines right at the top of his forehead and just above his chin. I also gave Henry the zenithal lighting process. You can see the really nice shadows coming up. Base coat, I used some of this red terracotta. Very light coat over it. Can't see the shadowing, but it's still there. Then for the highlights, I used some of this sand or ivory color. I then gave it a light coat over his whole face. Remember how I said the undercoat affects the top coat? With that terracotta base, it gives this top colour a more warmer, slightly reddier pinkish type tone to it. For the eyes, I'm using some of this white grey, because you don't want to use white, it's too stark on this scale. Right now, I do have an apology. I got so involved and focused on painting Henry's face that I forgot to record most of the process. Sorry about that. Now I base coated his hair black, and I'm using some of this brown from Ammo for the dry brushing. Now I did add a bit of white to it just to get variations of the colour. Sadly, the light I'm using in the video totally washed out his face, but there is detail there. With Henry done, it's time to move on the base. You do get two options with the base, one that has a conquered foe and Titus is actually standing on top of him, and another one without that. I wanted to use the flag, so I used a combination of both files and modified the base to suit my needs, and then added a lot more rock detail. Onto the print. Now originally I was going to print it on my resin printer, on the PHROZEN printer, because the plate is more than enough to house that base. Problem was it was going to take about 60 hours to print it, so I had to rethink that, and that's when I decided I'm going to use my BAMBU A1 filament printer. But this thing does have a much smaller build plate of 250mm, so I had to go in and cut and key the base. So I ended up printing on 3 different plates. To slice the model, I used BAMBU Studio from BAMBU Labs, and I was able to get 1 on each plate, and 2 of them were much smaller, so I was able to fit 2 of those. Some areas needed supporting, so I just clicked on the supports and changed that to tree, then hit the slice, and that did its calculations and its thinking and computations. Once it completed that, it told me it needed only about 5.5 hours to print. So if you work out the math, I've knocked it down from 60 hours to about a total of around 24 hours. Huge difference. Once that was all done, I then sent the file to the printer via Wi-Fi. This is a pretty big piece, so it took a little while to send, probably about, 30-40 seconds. I did speed up this section. Once the printer received the file, it then went through its process and set up the printer ready to go. The time lapse shows you the creation of the base. The camera they use for the time lapse is a bit average, but you still get your images. Now I use the AMS system as part of my whole combo here, and that feeds filament to the printhead. So if I run out of one filament roll, it will then automatically swap to the next one and keep printing, so you don't get any interruptions. And you don't have to be there for when it swaps over. You can even interchange the hothead on there from a 2 or 4mm with just a couple clicks. It's so simple to use. And here are my 4 pieces, and they come up really well. I must admit I was a bit nervous with my keying, because I've done a lot of cutting keying in resin printing, but filament works slightly different, so I wasn't sure how much clearance I would need between the keys. But it turned out to be spot on, so very happy about it. The only issue I had was the base was slightly warped, and I also got these printer lines, and originally I was going to fill these in, but I kind of looked at it and I thought that looks really alien, and I just ended up deciding just to keep those layer lines in there. So once I weather it, I think it'll look pretty awesome. To glue all the pieces together, I'm using some of this Gorilla super glue, and honestly I'm not a big fan of this stuff. It's just too thick and it takes too long to dry, so that's why I'm kind of trying to use it up on this base, because it actually cost me quite a fair bit of money. Not cheap, this stuff. Got it from Bunnings, and Bunnings also sells these $2 packs of super glue, and it's fantastic. That's what I buy all the time. Works great, nice and thin as well. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the bottom was a bit warped, so I cut out this plate out of some excess MDF and just stuck the base onto, well, the base. To fill up the joints, I'm using some of this multi-purpose filler from Unipro. All I need to do here is I'm just using this little spatula, pushing it into the joints, and once I've got it in there properly, I then grab a little brush and just smooth it out. I then left that for a few hours to dry, and for the base colours I'm using some of this green and brown. I bought these from Bunnings as well. Off camera I've given the whole thing of some of that black primer from Rust-Oleum. That acrylic paint I showed you, I thinned that down really thinly with some water. And I'm first starting off covering the whole thing in brown, and then hitting the flatter areas I'm using that green. And the key here is just to add a bit of visual interest, and I'm mixing it with the brown so it's not so bright as well. So I end up with this really nice contrast, sort of like a mold on top of that rock surface. We're at the point of the video where I think it's time to give you a story about Captain Titus from the world of Warhammer. Captain Titus of the Ultramarines stood on the ramparts of Hivescan, the last bastion of hope on the war-torn world of Valtheris Prime. Once a jewel of Imperial industry, the planet had become a nightmarish battlefield. Orc warlord, Gorok Skullcrusher and his endless green-skin horde had swept across the surface, turning cities into rubble and leaving only death in their wake. Worse still, a Chaos warband, led by the twisted sorcerer Malakar, had arrived to exploit the planet's chaos, summoning demonic reinforcements to claim the world for the ruinous powers. For weeks, the defenders of Valtheris Prime had fought a desperate losing battle. The planet's defenders were broken, their forces scattered. Only the arrival of Captain Titus and the Ultramarines' second company had kept hope alive. But now the final confrontation loomed, as the combined forces of Orcs and Chaos converged on Hivescan, eager to extinguish the last flicker of resistance. Titus, clad in his battle-scarred blue power armour, addressed his brothers as the enemy approached. His thunder hammer, a relic of Guilliman's arsenal, glowed faintly with the power field that had shattered countless foes. His voice, calm and commanding, echoed through the Hive's battlements.
Brothers, this is where we hold the line. For the Emperor, for Ultramar, for humanity itself, let them come. Let them see the strength of the Adeptus Astartes.
The horde came like a tidal wave. Orc war engines rumbled forward, their crude weaponry spitting death. Chaos Space Marines strode alongside demons, their unholy banners defiling the air. Titus stood at the forefront, his hammer smashing through Orcs with bone-crushing force. Bolt of fire rained down from his brothers, precise and deadly, but the enemy seemed endless. As the battle raged, Titus saw a massive Orc gargant striding toward the Hive walls. The machine, a monstrous amalgamation of metal plates and crude weaponry, bristled with guns and roared with the laughter of Orcs aboard. It fired a devastating salvo, blasting a breach in the Hive's defences. Titus rallied his forces.
With me, we take it down or all is lost.
Leading a strike force, he charged toward the gargant, cutting a path through the Orc horde. Titus leapt onto the massive war machine, scaling its hull as his brothers provided covering fire. He planted melter charges on its power core and leapt clear just as the explosives detonated, reducing the gargant to a fiery wreck. The blast tore through the Orc ranks, momentarily halting their advance, but the victory was short-lived. The sky darkened and a warp rift opened above the battlefield. Malakar emerged, flanked by demons and Chaos Space Marines. The sorcerer's voice boomed across the battlefield, laced with malice.
You fight in vain, Ultramarine. This world belongs to Chaos, and you shall be its final sacrifice.
Titus confronted Malakar directly, their battle a clash of divine faith and dark sorcery. The sorcerer unleashed bolts of warp energy, but Titus's iron resolve and the Emperor's blessing shielded him. He closed the distance, his thunder hammer glowing with righteous fury. With a roar, he struck Malakar, shattering the sorcerer's staff and sending him reeling. The demons, sensing their master's weakness, swarmed Titus. He fought like a lion, his hammer cleaving through unholy flesh, but their numbers overwhelmed him. Just as it seemed he might fall, reinforcements arrived. His brothers, led by Sergeant Sidonus, fought their way to his side, turning the tide. With one final strike, Titus obliterated Malakar, the sorcerer's body consumed by the warp. The rift began to collapse, dragging the demons back into the Immaterium. The Orcs, seeing their Chaos allies destroyed, broke and fled. The battle was won, but at a heavy cost. The hive lay in ruins and many of Titus's brothers had fallen. Yet the planet was saved and the name of Captain Titus was carved deeper into the annals of Ultramarines legend. As he stood amid the ruins and covered in the blood of the fallen, the weight of the Imperium's eternal war pressed heavily on him, but he remained unbroken. For Titus, the battle never truly ended. It was his duty to stand as the Emperor's shield against the darkness, no matter the cost. I gotta admit, I had an absolute blast creating that character. Captain Titus from Warhammer, starring Henry Cavill, coming out soon. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment in the comments. In the meantime, check out these videos and I'll catch you in the next one.